Behind me is a 1926 disappearing propeller boat called Warriorah. I first saw Warriorah when I was 8 years old. I was at my uncle's house in Toronto for my 8th birthday, and in the backyard this boat was upside down, being stripped, and in the basement were floorboards and seat parts which had been previously coated in tar. My uncle had them in vats of lye in the basement trying to get the tar off of all of the wooden parts. The boat was purchased by Paul's aunt in 1927. It's a 1926, and somebody put a deposit on it, apparently, and then in the spring, the original purchaser backed out of the deal, and then Paul's aunt bought the boat. The boat was used. They ran a very small hotel, more like a bed and breakfast, and there was no road to it. So this was the boat where they would pick people up from Port Carling and take them out to Atherley Bay to the hotel. They'd bring all the supplies, and this was a very important boat to them. It stayed in the family until my uncle had it. It was lost during Hurricane Hazel. It wound up at the bottom of the lake, and a fellow named Stan Carr basically was canoeing and saw it in the bottom, and they somehow got a hook on it and got the boat back up, and it sat in various states of disrepair. I've heard lots of stories about it from my uncle. They used to sink it in the winter just because they had nowhere to store it, so they figured the bottom of the lake was the safest place to store it. My uncle told me he would take the engine out and then just sink the boat and then lift it up in the spring and put the engine back in. Back in the 60s, a lot of boats like this were at the point, we're kind of coming to that point in the wooden boat world now where the interest has waned quite a bit and nobody knew how to fix them anymore, and the people who had built them had all kind of retired or died, and it really was a bad time for wooden boats. And then somehow in the late 60s, 70s, people started discovering the value of these things and restoring them. Anybody who's ever had a Dispro probably knows Paul Doddington. He's been responsible for probably keeping most of them running, and really headed the renaissance of the restoration of these boats. Anyway, back in the 60s, nobody really had the time or the money or the knowledge to know how to restore them properly, so Paul, doing the best he could to save the boat and keep it going, he got a Canadian Tire fiberglass kit and basically fiberglassed the bottom of the boat. That's kind of frowned upon with a lot of people, but it has its good and bad points. The good point is, I mean, it gave this boat an extra life from 1967 or 1968 until now. The fiberglass, is getting tired. It was only polyester resin, but the boat was in the water running last summer and was driven to the ramp and picked up, but there are a lot of issues that were kind of band-aided up with the repair, but the boat has functioned well, and it's a lot of sentimental value. It is the family boat. So I'm going to grab the camera and we'll just walk around and have a look at some of the things that are going on with it. Paul's health, his mobility is really failing these days. He did manage to take most of the parts off of the boat and the seats out with the help of his daughter Amy, and I have it in my shop now, and we're just going to, I've spent the last day and a half taking the floorboards out and degreasing the hull. One thing about a Dispro is when you take them apart, you have the area of about 5 boats. But I'm going to grab the camera, I'll just walk around the boat. So this is basically just a bare hull now. At some point a new gas tank was made and it didn't quite fit, so they actually had to move the hole in the deck. But there's an awful lot of oil on the bottom. Here at the front, the ribs are all broken. I remember Paul telling me that was from bailing the boat, basically scraping the tin pot along the ribs, and it's worn the ribs out. This is after a gallon of degreaser through the bilge, and about an hour with a pressure washer. I took the device out. This is the hole. Now the device back in 1968, you couldn't just go down to the hardware store and buy stainless steel bolts. So there were steel bolts or iron bolts holding the device in. I just used a cut-off wheel and cut them all off. But this is usually where most of the problems happen in a device. Now, when Paul fiberglassed it, he did wrap the glass around the hole. It has been a fairly successful job for a number of decades, but the ribs are pretty much shot. The other thing is over here, the seat riser has collapsed. Now, most port crawling boats, they usually have 2 finishing nails. This one only has 1. I have a feeling the nails have probably just rusted off, and that's why the driver's seat is kind of collapsing there. This boat has probably had more use than any Dispro around. It's been in continuous service for several decades. The planking is all cypress. This boat is, other than having the fiberglass applied, has pretty well been untouched. Here is the glass around the stem, but a lot of people condemn fiberglass. I don't think it's a bad thing. The bad thing with fiberglass is if you have a rotten boat and you fiberglass the rot will accelerate. The one nice thing about cypress is if you have the heartwood, it does not rot. If you go to the lumber yard and just buy cypress, chances are 90% of it will be sapwood, and it will rot faster than cedar or pine. I've known some boat builders, they just hear that cypress doesn't rot, they just go and buy it blindly and put it in using sapwood, and it does not last. On this side here, there are a few broken planks, so I have a feeling that this job is going to entail replacing the keel, stem and stern post, and probably at least 4 rounds of planking. I think the intention is to repair the hull and then refiberglass it, which will make the boat very user-friendly. You can live in a trailer or a lift, basically, or sit in the water and not have any water in the bilge. The decks are pretty much original. Now behind me here is a pile of parts that I've taken out of the boat. That is one of the worst things about a Dispro is when you take it apart. If I spread these out, it would take 4 or 5 times as much room as the boat. So I've marked all of the floorboards, all of the mechanical bits from the device and the starter. These floorboards were, I think, probably done by the Boat Works. Originally, the Dispro floorboards, they would have been fastened straight onto the ribs, and it would only took about 1.5 quarts of water, and then they were over the floorboards. So this boat had floorboards made with riser frames, which were all on the ribs here, and these made the floorboard quite a bit higher than the bilge. So if you had a bit of water in the bilge, it wasn't over the floors, and psychologically it was probably a better thing. Here's the prop shaft with a 1.5 inch universal joint. The alignment has to be right on before you can use an 1.5 inch universal joint. If the alignment is off a bit, an 1.5 inch universal joint will rub against the side of the housing. But mechanically, this boat is one of the best ones. It will idle to about 50 RPM. And here's the gas tank. And behind here is the original engine. It's a Silent Dispro Model E, which Paul has done quite a bit of work on. Still has good compression, runs like a finely tuned watch. And over here in the corner, Paul told me that he does have a new device casting. This one, Paul is one of those people who can get the last 5 seconds out of something. And this device casting was actually rotted through, so Paul has actually done a repair on it here with some bolts and aluminum plates. But you can see the inside of this casting is almost paper thin. The only thing holding it together is the rust and that little repair there. So the bronze bits are all still good for it, but this casting, it's one of the original cast iron ones. It's pretty well worn out. So that's about it for now.